The Colonial Pipeline ransomware attack was one of the biggest cyber events of the year, demonstrating just how much of an impact a cyber attack can have on the infrastructure that runs our everyday lives. Has this been a big wake-up call to how operational technology is secured, or is there still much more to do? And what types of threats are out there that could pose challenges to organizations in this industry? I'm Danny Palmer. This is ZDNet Security Update. And with me to discuss this is Sergio Caltagirone, Vice President of Threat Intelligence at Dragos. Thanks for joining me, Sergio. So first of all, can you give us a bit of a reminder of what happened with the Colonial Pipeline ransomware attack? Because over there in the US, it obviously had a massive impact on the northeastern seaboard.
It certainly did. So Colonial Pipeline is a multi-thousand mile oil and gas pipeline. And it transports a large percentage of the natural gas as well as the gasoline and so forth that travels between the Midwest United States and the eastern side of the United States. It's not unlike pipelines that run throughout Europe, run throughout Asia, run throughout Africa. Where you have 1,000 miles of pipeline between supply and demand, of course, where you have to transport volatile liquids and gases. Now, the challenge here is, of course, that these companies that run these pipelines, they are, first of all, it's best to understand that, most of the time, it's best to see them as manufacturing companies, not as, a lot of people think of a pipeline and they think of like a pipe in their house, where you put water in one side and water comes out the other side. When you have pipelines of thousands of miles, not only that, but the Colonial Pipeline is structured such that there are about 180 compression stations throughout its thousands of miles of pipe. What you end up doing is basically think of it as 180 pipes. Because you can break each one into sections, and interestingly, each section can carry completely different material. One section could have gasoline in it ready for vehicles, and the next section could have a different unique hydrocarbon that needs to be reprocessed later on. So you can't just, so when something happens to these pipelines, first of all, every section of the pipeline has to be heated or cooled or compressed or pressurized in a certain way, depending on the necessary requirements of that chemical and so forth. So it's an interesting one, because when we talk about Colonial Pipeline, it's important to have that background, because without that background, you don't understand what I'm about to tell you, which is that a piece of ransomware got in through into the IT network, and they caused a lot of problems and basic business operations issues. The problem with it is that because of a pipeline and how it operates, you have to know what you're bringing into the pipeline, where it's at the entire time of the process, and then of course, where it's going to go at the end of the pipeline. You have to have the right ships or the right containers. You have to have the right ports, the right trucks lined up for when that stuff comes out. It's got to be handled in the right way. You can't just dump it on the ground or let it loose in the air and things like that for obvious reasons. And so all of that requires a huge logistical problem and requires a lot of coordination. And you have hundreds of companies pumping stuff through these pipelines. It's not like the pipeline goes into the ground and stuff comes out, right? You have trucks and you have container ships and stuff delivering stuff into these pipelines all the time. So there's a huge accounting problem. So when you lose business operations in a pipeline, that becomes a major issue. Now the pipeline can't keep track of what's in it, where that stuff is, and what it's going to do when the stuff comes out at the end. And now, of course, that could cause ecological disasters. It could cause life safety issues. People could die. Explosions could happen. These are not safe things to be dealing with. And so out of an abundance of caution, Colonial decided to shut down its pipeline operations. What it basically did was it said, whatever's in the pipeline is going to stay in the pipe. And we're going to basically hold it there as long as we possibly can. That way, at least we don't have ecological disasters or things like that. The challenge with this is, again, that now, and they did that out of abundance of caution, right? And they did it for less than a week of outage. But of course, now realize that a pipeline operates over thousands of miles by taking a little bit of energy out of the pipe to operate its compressor stations. So it actually uses some of the material in the pipeline to power itself. Now, once you shut the pipeline down, you got to bring it back up. That's not easy to do. And again, realizing that every section of this pipeline has to be basically dealt with like entirely differently. And so they had to roll out trucks, like diesel generator trucks, to restart these compressor stations to get the pipeline going, which is why it took days to bring it back online. And this is a great example for the public as to why industrial control systems and the cybersecurity around them is so unique from, say, email outages and regular business outages, where if bad things happen, and bringing this stuff back online is very complicated and very dangerous.
That's the thing. It's been a real eye-opener because there's been plenty of ransomware attacks over the years. If it affects business X or Y, stopping them from able to access their files, things that are obviously bad for the business, bad for customers, but aren't really having effect on the physical items that people can get. Well, when this attack hit the pipeline, because the pipeline was shut down, suddenly you had queues of people lining up to try and rush for gas because they didn't know when it was going to be possible. And it was just one of those things that showed how a cyber attack, especially against infrastructure like this, it's not, cyber isn't just some mythical land away from the physical world. They're both the same thing. And this showed that this has a massive impact, and that these systems, these industrial systems, some of which have been running for decades on the same old technology, are now at risk from cyber attacks in this way.
Yeah, and Danny, you bring up such a great point, and I'm so glad you did it, which is so insightful, which is that in the industrial sector, we think of the immediate consequences, like I said, ecological damage, physical damage to plants or people, and so forth. But really, the largest impact to industrial control problems is psychological. If you think about it, an attack against the levee system in, say, Holland, or the levee system in, say, New Orleans, where that is psychologically very sensitive to a population. You could have major power outages, even for the shortest period of time, can cause psychological challenges for a population, especially if it's like during a heat event or during a massive cold spell. And so in many cases, an industrial control attack doesn't have to be large, and it doesn't have to be an explosion for it to have a massive impact on what the population sees as security and safety that it deserves from its organizations around it.
And one of the interesting things about this case in particular is, it was by a ransomware gang, obviously looking to make money. And the way these attackers, they basically look at networks, see what's out there, encrypt it, and then sort of see what's going on. And they in a way, it seems they might not have known what they were getting themselves into, because they thought, okay, we've ransomwared this office infrastructure, which is then turned out to be connected to an industrial pipeline. And suddenly this ransomware group had the White House asking questions about them. And it seems to have really escalated in terms of showing the damage that ransomware can do, and also escalated the response, because ransomware has been a problem for several years now. We had incidents like WannaCry a few years ago, which over here in the UK affected the National Health Service very badly. That was back in a few years ago. And now ransomware continued to cause massive problems, but now it's suddenly in the US affected oil and gas, and suddenly the White House might be knocking on your door, which, if you're a ransomware gang, might be a slightly intimidating prospect.
Exactly. There's been that question has always been posed to me, which is that we focus a lot in the industrial space on state or state-associated threats. And that is a whole nother topic of conversation we can touch. But on the criminal side, it's always been a question is, why aren't we seeing more criminal attacks against critical infrastructure, industrial control systems? And the answer is that there's two reasons. One, because impacting industrial control systems is actually not simple. It's not easy. In fact, in this case, in Colonial, the adversary kind of got lucky. They didn't know exactly, like you said, what the potential outcome would be. But that also is why this is so darn dangerous in the industrial sector. because even the owners and operators of industrial equipment cannot guarantee what will happen if you start injecting unpredictable events inside of an operational plant or industrial process. And not only that, but if ransomware gets in, so we've seen things like Ekans, we've seen things like Clop, Megacortex, we've seen ransomware that directly affects industrial control systems. It's looking in its list of targets, it's looking for industrial control system processes to shut down and ransom. Now, if you do that to the wrong plant, you could have really, really serious consequences, because these plants are not designed to have unpredictable events occur. And when that happens, unpredictable outcomes happen. And so we always caution the industrial control sector space with, it's not the adversary who wants to take you down that is necessarily the one you need to worry about the most. It's the adversary who's inside your operations, your critical operations parts that don't know what they're doing, that actually may pose the greatest risk to something really, really bad happening. And we have lots of cases of actually accidental disruption occurring inside of the industrial space. And the second to that is, you blow something up and you kill people, you're going to be put on lists that you don't want to be on. And I think that this was a great example of where ransomware stuck its, where a criminal element stuck its nose into a place it didn't want to be, and it showed. And I think this is a good, I think that the US response to this was extremely positive, in that it wasn't as strong as I think some cybersecurity experts would have preferred it to be, but at least it moved us in the direction as a community to say, look, there is a line, you don't cross it, and you better be a lot more careful in the future. Now, we're not going to come after you if you take down every email server, right? But there is a line there, like that we will place tremendous amounts of pressure on you.
This has me thinking about an incident that happened a few months before Colonial, the water treatment plant in Florida, where someone came in and just seemed to want to mess about with the systems and almost ended up poisoning the water supply. And it's, again, that wasn't some sort of state-backed, sophisticated group. That was someone just trying their luck and going, okay, this is interesting, and just messing about and almost causing massive issues. And I suppose the question from here is, what do these incidents show the industrial control system operators and the infrastructure that's reliant on these, and in terms of their security and what they should be looking at to help secure these networks? Because as discussed, some of these systems are running on operating systems which aren't really even supported anymore. Things like old DOS systems or early version of Microsoft Windows, which you might not be able to get, you can't get patches for anymore. So how do organizations ensure that their networks aren't going to be affected by just some guy coming in and seeing what they can do? Yeah,
I think you have to start at the top level, which are boards of directors, governments, policy groups need to start putting pressure on the operators, whether they're state operators or quasi-state operations or completely private operations, right? They need to put pressure on organizations to do something. And it is and that's the first thing, and that's starting to happen, right? There is now pressure coming out of the US White House on electric organizations, oil and gas organizations, to start doing something about all of this. You're seeing movement in the UK, although the UK started moving honestly ahead of the US years ago to help put pressure on private industry and quasi-government industries. And so I think that there is movement. I think that we're getting to the point now where we had an opportunity to get ahead of this problem, and this problem caught up with us. There's very few opportunities in cybersecurity where you get the benefit of foresight. And this is one of those where we still can see a little bit ahead. Like we're not as far ahead as we should be, but we can see that this is going to be a bigger problem. We all know that. And the problem is now we just got to get us operationally there. And so the second thing that has to happen, I think, is, and this is a weird thing to say, but there's got to be funding. And this is really challenging. Now, talk about something that's hard as the water sector. In the US, we're talking about tens of thousands of pieces of water infrastructure. You talk about Switzerland, you're talking about you're talking about tens of thousands of pieces of water infrastructure, that are managed by individual cantons and so forth, and towns and municipalities and even neighborhoods, right, and things like that. Like managing water infrastructure is really hard, and there's almost no money around it. We all know that water infrastructure by itself globally is falling apart because of lack of investment. Now you add cybersecurity on top of it and you get a bigger problem. So I think the thing is, what has to happen is one realization that there's got to be a push. And then the second thing is we got to figure out funding. And this is not, it sounds weird to say, but there is a very little money sufficient to cover the amount of critical infrastructure we actually have at risk.
And with these incidents, these were cyber criminals doing this. There have been incidents, Dragos detailed earlier this year, incidents of state-backed hacking operations looking at power grids and all sorts of critical infrastructure. And what sort of effects could that have? Because these aren't just some people having a go. These are organizations which are it's their job to try and enter these networks, and it sounds as if that some real work needs to be done in order to help secure these networks from these threats.
Yeah, so in the state cases, in the cases of a state-associated adversary, where that's a state or a state-backed, or sometimes states pay third parties to do this for them, so forth. The challenge is here, it's more about detection. It's more about, look, you get a $100 million state operation running up against a $10 million cybersecurity budget, you're gonna lose. I'm sorry, like there's just it's not reasonable. I've worked for 20 years against the top, and I've worked for fortunately the top hacking organizations in the world, and I can tell you that there's very little you can do about it. The biggest important thing that these organizations can do is detect and respond. Those adversaries, again, speaking as somebody who used to be a state hacker, right? The biggest concern I had was detection and response. It was that they're going to see what I'm doing and then do something about it. If they saw what I was doing, it didn't do anything about it, like I care. But the thing is that you got to have detection informed response. And so for these organizations, when you're talking about state-sponsored attacks, you've got to have detection, you got to have response. Prevention, there's a little bit you can do, but it's not, you're never going to out budget these teams. It's, like I said, all about detection and response. You got to get there fast and you got to do something about it. The good thing is that these industrial control systems, and I can tell you from personal experience, are very complicated. And if you wanted to actually take down and disrupt a control system in a way that you wanted to, of course, you could always go in and do what we call the push button approach, which is push all the buttons and see what happens. And that some adversaries are doing that, unfortunately. But if you actually wanted to have a deterministic outcome, I wanted this plant to blow up at this time because I wanted to do this, or that I wanted this transmission station to go out at this time because of an election or something like that. If you want to have deterministic approaches, deterministic outcomes as a hacker, you're going to spend months studying the operations of those facilities. And that, as a defender, is like such the critical time where you could have found them and done something to have prevented them from knowing enough to do what they wanted to do. So we do have a chance to stop it. I'm not saying that it's impossible, but you have to take the opportunity to do it.
Well, hopefully anyone watching this involved in this space will take this message on board and look to help protect their networks or the networks of others around them in the ICS and OT industry from these types of cyber attacks. Thanks for joining me on ZDNet Security Update, Sergio. And for more information on how to keep your network secure from cyber attacks, be sure to like and subscribe to the ZDNet YouTube channel. Of course, there's plenty of articles and features on zdnet.com. Thanks for watching.